Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thanks for coming. The first point I have to make is that when this idea of doing an event came forward, I was asked what the title of it could be, and in fact, it was how to write a British Muslim novel. As you just mentioned, somehow along the line, the title has got changed to How to Write a British Novel, which is somewhat different. But actually, I quite like that, because the question is really, what is the difference between a British Muslim novel and a British novel and an English novel? And what place does fiction have in the telling of the stories that we would like to be told? And more specifically, me, what kind of story I wanted to tell in this book that I've written. The British Muslim novel has had a bit of a checkered history, really. Defining it is quite hard. Let's leave aside all the wonderful writers from the Indian subcontinent who have written over the years, starting Ahmad Ali or Atiya Hussain, who wrote in English, but weren't by any stretch, British, as it were. Let's think of people who were either settled here for a long time or were born in Britain and in some way could be classified as Muslim. Immediately you start to run into difficulties and problems. In 89 and 90, two books were published, two novels, which were in some ways British Muslim novels. The first of these, you might have heard of it, it's called The Satanic Verses by Salman Rushdie. That, in a way, was both the inauguration of the British Muslim novel, and it was also the inauguration of, in a way, the British Muslim community, because through that moment of opposition and debate and anger and refutation, a novel became the principal talking point. And it's issues that we talk about now, about representation, what it means to be authentic, what is the pace of literary playfulness, to what extent can we present our own culture to the outside world with a level of levity or lightness. All those issues were discussed then, but in such a sort of charged political atmosphere that I think it kind of was quite intimidating in some ways. For anyone who's trying to write about British Muslims or Islam in Britain, that moment overshadows everything, really. And you notice that it seems like every 5 years there's an anniversary, and there becomes a sort of welter of programs. Yet again, there's a series of podcasts or a TV show or articles published. I've done it myself. But we keep wanting to replay the Satanic Verses moment again and again. And I suppose it's because people can peg attitudes and arguments to it. I'm not actually that interested in replaying those arguments. It was a long time ago. I don't think, if it's fair to say, that it was a moment of... I don't think it was the British Muslims community's greatest moment, let's put it that way. But also, we'd hopefully like to move on from that as well. 1990, Hanif Qureshi, certainly, Pakistani father, although I don't think he would classify himself as Muslim as such, but he did write about Muslim characters in his book, The Buddha of Suburbia. Now, it's a very fresh, very funny, rather cold book in many ways. I remember reading it when I was 16 or 17, and there's a definite trajectory. The trajectory is that the boy who grows up in the suburbs, he needs to escape them, and he needs to escape his background and religion, and basically David Bowie is his model for sort of integration and enjoyment in the world of London and in the West. And the book is about a character's journey from moving away from whatever vestiges of his sort of home culture, if you want to put it that way, is all about. I mean, Qureshi himself is not really interested in Islam in that book. There's a scene I remember reading quite vividly when a character dies, and he goes, he's buried, and Karim Amir, who's the main character, goes to the funeral. And he's sort of speaking for Qureshi when he says he looks at the funeral and he sees people arguing over what direction the body should be buried in. Should it be towards Qibla, or which direction is Qibla, and all the rest of it. And the character, I think, says he couldn't imagine finding any of that interesting at all, and he sort of turns away. And that's a sort of his little sort of vignette. And the funny thing is, when I was reading it, I was thinking, no, actually, I think that's really interesting. I think that's actually such a fascinating scene. What it might mean for people to be having those kind of theological arguments in a situation where somebody is being buried. Are there rivalries between the families? What are those people's lives like? But they're sort of glimpsed out the corner of their eye, but they're never really looked at in much detail. Somewhat of a hiatus, because these things tend to go in clutches. And by 2002-03, we had Monica Ali's Brick Lane, which is not, a good novel, quite interesting book. Again, the narrative of sort of but it's set in Bangladeshi community in the East End of London, and then again it was presented, as the title indicates, as a sort of anthropological eye telling you exactly what British Bangladeshis think about this. At least that's the way it was presented. The book is a bit more subtle than that. And by 2006, we had Nadim Aslam's book Maps for Lost Lovers. Now, he was born in Pakistan, but was brought up in the UK. And Maps for Lost Lovers is set in a sort of Yorkshire, and it's about basically about an honour killing. It's very poetically written. In a way, it has a lot of beauty in that book, although I think his first book, set in Pakistan, is really brilliant. Again, though, that the same sort of themes seem to be coming out. If you write a British Muslim novel, it seems to be about, it has to be about honour killing or about women being oppressed in East End Bangladeshi communities. And by 2006, of course, we'd had 9/11 and 7/7, and so that brought another set of narratives about the British Muslim community, and this idea of, the figure of the Muslim terrorist became quite a sort of popular one among certain novelists. So we have the spectre of John Updike and Martin Amis writing pretty terrible novels about British Muslim characters. And so terrorism generally became the frame through which Muslims in general in Britain were looked through, and also that filtered into literature at the same time. One exception, though, which was actually quite interesting, John le Carré, the thriller writer, wrote a really good book called A Most Wanted Man, which is about sort of terrorism, but it's dealt with in a much more subtle way. And actually, it's much more a sort of quite searing critique on the war on terror. So that's definitely worth looking up. So some authors did look at these issues in interesting ways, but by no stretch of the imagination could you say that that was a book about, what British Muslim lives are actually about. And then there's just very little after that. And I suppose what I was trying to do with this book, the struggles that I had with it in some ways, were trying to create characters who I felt were real, dealing with issues that I felt were interesting, but in a way that tried to resist the temptations of, or the traps in a way that are sort of lay in front of you when you're trying to write about characters who are very rarely written about within mainstream literary culture. My challenge really was to create a style that somehow fitted the characters, but also fitted the form of the British novel, and also fitted the form of the kind of novel that I wanted to write. So that's really what I was thinking about when I started writing this book, probably in about 2009. So yes, it's been a long time, about 10 years of gestation, and as you can see, it's not a very long book. But it has gone through many different iterations and changes. And part of that is very normal for a first novel. But I think also I did struggle with the idea of how to bring these characters out. Did I want to include any kind of narrative to do with extremism? Or should I avoid that completely? Did I want to write about arranged marriages or not arranged marriages? Did I want to write about Islam in a deep way? Or did I want to write about characters who were just Muslim and that impacted on their lives because of that, but their way they deal with it is very different? At every point, I tried to make a decision to trust the characters and trust the story, and to whatever themes that there are, and there are some you can pick out, keep them quite buried deep below. So I hope that this book is something that you could read and enjoy as a novel. Certainly, I tried to make it that way, but it's also, as I said, has some of those themes as well. So, a brief description of what the novel is about. Asghar and Zara, yes, it says it on the front cover. It's about these two young-ish characters. Asghar is 19 at the start of the novel, and Zara is 22. And it starts on their wedding day. And what I thought would be fun to explore is the first year of their marriage. These two people have sort of, in the way that sort of modern people do these days, arranged their own marriage, or rather, their families know each other, but they've sort of sorted it out for themselves. But one of the key things is that these two characters are very, very different. So Asghar, you could say, is more community-minded. He's certainly more strictly religious. He is not somebody who goes out into the world, outside world, very much. Zara, as she would call herself, Zahra more correctly, but Zara is probably what she would call herself, is a bit older. She's been to Cambridge. She's much more, in a way, to put it crudely, westernized. She's still interested in her background and her culture to some extent, but her journey is in some ways about her sort of getting away from her background because for what she sees as a world of success in the outside world. And she feels like she has to sort of, in a way, destroy her old self in order for a new and more successful self to be born. So I thought, in a way, that's the central argument of the book. So it's between the person who stays more towards his community and is more community-orientated and the person who sort of moves away. And these are arguments that I've experienced in my own life and I've thought about. I had the idea for this novel in 2009, which was 3 years before I myself got married, so any autobiographical inferences can't really be made. I'm very happy to say that, I have a very, inshallah, a happy and successful marriage. So it's more about the idea of you think about decisions that you could have made and what if you'd made the wrong decision, if you see what I mean. So the book starts with them getting married on their wedding day, and although they are from the same community, a community which remains unnamed throughout the book, which bears a passing resemblance, you may find some familiarities in scenes and various things, but I'm keen to stress it is fiction. No community is named in the book. So I was thinking about what was it like to have these two characters who were quite very, very different from the same community put together. One of the first lines, and actually a reviewer of the book very kindly actually picked out one of these lines. One of the first lines I thought about, which went into the book, was this idea that what does it mean to have a mixed marriage? We think of mixed marriages as somebody who's from a different background or different religion or a different race marrying each other, and lots of stories about, how do these people get along. But in a way, every marriage is a mixed marriage because people are so different and they have such different expectations of things and they have such individual ways of approaching things. You can be from exactly the same community, be exactly the same pretty much age, be a British Muslim, but you can have very different views of the world. So the novel follows the course of their life over the year, and then we get various flashbacks as to what they experience and what they go through. And maybe the best thing to do to give you a flavour of it is just to do a few little tiny readings, and then I'll sort of go through and discuss the meanings of that and why I wrote them and all the rest of it. So let's take Asghar to start with. What kind of person is he? What kind of personality is he? Well, like many of us, he was formed a lot by his childhood. And his childhood experiences make him the kind of person that he is. And slowly throughout the book, you get these sort of flashback revelations where you see, maybe that's why he behaves in the way that he does, or maybe this is how his personality was formed. So I'm just going to read you a little bit of one of these flashback scenes. Let me set it up for you. So Asghar is maybe about 12 years old at this point. He is he's at school. And he is in what in this school is called a scripture class. It's usually called religious education or RE or something different now. But when I was growing up, I was in a scripture class, so that's why I called it that. Also, I think it's just kind of more interesting name for it, really. Scripture. So sort of it's got a sort of heaviness and a power to it. And this definitely has drawn slightly on my own experience, because when I was younger, I did have the experience of my teacher asking me to do a presentation about Islam to the class. Yeah, so they didn't know anything about Islam or religion, Muslim religion, but they assumed that I, as a 12-year-old, would know all about it, and so therefore they would sit at the back of the class and you'd have to do a presentation, which indeed I did. In this fictional version, Oscar is being paired with Danny, who is a Jewish boy who's one of his friends. So at the top of the class, you have Danny and you have Oscar both talking about their religious background. Mr. Powell is the name of the teacher, the headmaster of the school, in fact, and he is a character in this scene, as you'll see as well. In scripture class the next week, Danny, wearing a black skull cap and striped shawl, read out a short history of the Jewish people. He started with Abraham and Moses and carried on with Joseph and King David. He stumbled over some of the Hebrew words, but when he was done, Mr. Powell praised him for doing an excellent job. Oscar stood up wearing a red-checked scarf his father had brought back from Mecca. Using notes culled from Madrasa, he outlined the basic tenets of Islamic belief. He stressed the closeness between Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Did they know, Oscar said, that the Torah, the Psalms, and the Gospel were all revered in the Quran as holy books? Did they know that the prophets Danny had mentioned were all in the Quran with Arabic names, Ibrahim and Musa, Yusuf and Dawood? In fact, he added, reading from his sheet, we consider all these prophets to be Muslims. Delani, I have a question, Mr. Powell called out from the back of the class. Oscar looked up nervously. Danny has just told us that these prophets were of Israel, so how were they Muslims? Oscar went over what he read out. Whoever had written the worksheet was obviously delighted to allow these prophets the privilege of being Muslim. Seeing Mr. Powell's expression and that of his classmates, though, Oscar realized that outsiders might see such relabeling not as generous acceptance, but as staking an unfair claim. When we say these prophets are Muslim, we don't mean they're, actual Muslims, he stumbled. They believed in Allah, which is the same as God, and they have a holy book. That's like being a Muslim. Doesn't it say in the Quran, asked Mr. Powell, with a small smile playing on his lips, that Abraham and Moses were from the tribe of Israel? Does it? Said Oscar, scrambling through his notes. Isn't it odd that I seem to know more about your religion than you do? Asked Mr. Powell. The class tittered. Sir, said Danny, isn't it true that Christians say the Torah predicted Jesus? Passages in the Old Testament do predict the Messiah, he said. Nothing, as far as I know, mentions the Muslim prophet. Speaking of which, why don't you take us on a journey through the Arabian sands? Delani. Oscar rushed through an account of the prophet's achievements. So, what's going on there is sort of a number of things. There's the odd experience of as a 12-year-old, you having to sort of be a representative of your religion. And you're sort of being set up in a way by someone in this scene to set up to fail in some ways. Because Mr. Powell doesn't understand, or he pretends not to understand, the theological complexities of why Abraham, Ibrahim, Musa, Moses. And that line, isn't it strange that I know more about your religion than you do, is particularly resonant for me, because I've had many times the experience of people, as it were, Islam-splaining to me. People who think that they understand the religion better than you do. And in fact, something like this incident, although I've exaggerated, happened to me even when I was in that class. But since then, I've been at sort of events, gatherings, dinners, parties, as part of my job. Often when, the subject of Islam comes up, you are the audience to accept somebody else's argument. And often the person speaking to you really doesn't know what they're talking about. But what's more interesting for me is often you don't know why they don't know what they're talking about. So you don't necessarily have all the knowledge at your fingertips to be able to make the debate or the argument or refute them, which leads to a sort of cringing or embarrassing sense that you're both an outsider because you're this Muslim person who doesn't really understand, the way we, as in, in the sense Christianity, the right Christian way, as it were, but also you're not sort of Muslim enough, because you don't understand your religion enough to be able to explain the theological complexities of it. Why I wanted to add Danny as a character, the Jewish character, as well, is because I wanted to sort of, and throughout the book, there is a sort of comparison between Jewish community and Jewish characters and Muslim characters, because they're sort of going through the same thing in a way. But Danny's a bit more sophisticated, is a bit older, and he tries to play Mr. Powell, the prime minister, the headmaster at his own game by saying, well, isn't Jesus predicted in the Old Testament? I.e., didn't Christianity also appropriate the Jewish prophets for itself, if you see what I mean? So there's this scene where these three characters are at school doing their, but it's also playing out sort of maybe more a sort of deeper interpretation or experience. I also tried to make the scene, as light as possible and hopefully humorous as well. So in a way, that kind of experience was the kind of thing I never really seen described in a novel before. Certainly not one that was written about British Muslims. You do actually get it in some American Jewish writers in the 50s and 60s. There was a whole sort of burgeoning of Jewish writing. Philip Roth, Saul Bellow, Bernard Malamud, and I think they're quite an inspiration to some extent to me because they were also outsiders whose parents and grandparents spoke different languages. They also had a religion that was treated with suspicion, and they also were sort of had half one foot in and half 1 foot out of their own communities. And they managed to essentially, within about 30 years, make Jewish literature American literature. We have yet to see whether the same pattern will be replayed with British Muslim literature. So that's Oscar. He's sort of at that age, quite naive and feels uncomfortable in the presence of people who he feel will question him about things that he might feel uncomfortable about. What about Zara? Well, I'll take a little scene from Zara a bit later on. So Zara, where is it? This is actually before she's got married. This is another sort of mini flashback scene. She has graduated from university and is working at a bank in London. And she is herself trying to negotiate the kind of limits of how much she's willing to push herself and change her personality, change her the religious precepts that she grew up with in order to fit in. So if Oscar is a character who's sort of afraid of changing himself very much to fit in, Zara is a character who more boldly tries to change herself to try and fit in, if you see what I mean. So again, going back to some of the previous novels I talked about, you might say that's a similar trajectory to, say, The Buddha of Suburbia or in Brick Lane. But the difference in this book is that I didn't want to write a book in which I told you what the right answer was, because I don't think there is a right answer. And I didn't want to write a book that was naive about the difficulties and damage you may do to yourself as a person by pushing against the values that you have been brought up with. So I wanted to, as it were, push her quite far and see how far she would go. And when I came and started writing these scenes, I didn't really know how they would end up, but I wanted to sort of push them to see, what her limits were. So just to set up this scene, Zara's been in the bank for a few months, and she has been taken out for lunch by her boss, a woman called Sally. And Sally is trying to tell her that she likes her and she wants to promote her, but there are also other things involved in wanting to get a promotion. Sally took her to a fancy fish restaurant in a covered market nearby. They sat at a wooden table without a cloth, the surface scored with scratches and burn marks that were supposed, Zara imagined, to give the place a rustic, fishing village-like feel. Sally recommended she get the market fish, and could she be so bold as to order some wine? Zara, presuming that she was asking permission to drink in her presence, nodded readily. Though she had never touched the stuff, she took pride in not being bothered by alcohol. At parties, she had often encouraged others to drink and brought rounds of beers while she was having tap water herself. It was her way of deflecting questions about why she didn't join in. But when the waiter brought the white wine, and after Sally dismissed his offers to test whether it was corked, "I'm sure it's perfect," she said. Zara found that before she could say anything, she had been poured a glass. The wine lay there in a large curved glass, resting elegantly, looking no more offensive than a light apple juice. The waiter brought over their food. They had both ordered the same thing, braised haddock with new potatoes and vegetables. Once she had dished out the carrots and peas, the waiter refilled Sally's empty wine glass. He then topped up Zara's glass, even though she hadn't yet drunk from it. There was a pause in the conversation as they both set about their meals. Zara cut into her haddock with a fish knife and began carefully removing the toothpick bones. Sally, she saw, was already taking big mouthfuls, pulling the bones from her mouth like a magician. "One of the reasons I identified you early on," she said, "was because there's a particular market we would love to invest with us. And it's a market you could be of great help with. I'm talking of the Muslim pound." "Okay. There's a lot of entrepreneurship in your community," said Sally. "All those Indian food companies, cash and carry empires, we're losing out to the other high street banks because we don't have the same connections. Which is why I want you to join a new team I'm setting up that will pay special attention to ethnic minority customers. You can be the Muslim representative." "What will I be expected to do?" asked Zara. "Exploit your contacts. Talk to your father's friends at the mosque, certain overseas clients from the Middle East. Tell them we can make the accounts compliant with Sharia, that we promise not to invest their money in Israel, that kind of thing." She took another gulp of wine. "Think about it," she said, calling the waiter for a bill. "I'll do it," said Zara quickly. "Of course, I would be delighted to join the team." "Excellent," said Sally, who didn't look the slightest bit surprised. "Shall we toast?" She raised her wine glass. Zara looked down. On the table, she was confronted by the overfilled wine glass and the mineral water she had been drinking through the meal. "Cheers," said Sally expectantly. Zara raised the heavy wine glass. "Cheers," she said, and clinked Sally's glass a little too hard. She let the wine wash over her carefully sealed lips. "Cheers," she said, while lowering her glass, to draw attention to her choice, but Sally was too busy paying the bill with a company card to notice. So, in that scene, I was trying to, again, push the character, but also present a sort of moral dilemma for her. So she's been taken out by her boss. She's in a situation where she wants to impress, she wants to do the right thing. She's then been told that she has to be, as it were, the Muslim representative in the bank, and that they're all very keen on the Muslim pound, and it's all about ethnic minority representation and diversity, the kind of chatter that's quite familiar these days from anyone who works in any kind of corporate environment. It's all about diversity these days, isn't it? Except that with Sally, it's not about real diversity, as in it's not about accommodating other people's belief systems. It's more about getting people from a certain background, making them one of their own, as it were, and that's the whole thing to do with toasting and, being offered wine, and then sort of utilizing them for profit, in a sense. That might seem a cynical interpretation, but not a few days ago, I heard a story of a young Muslim woman who works in institutions similar to Zara, being taken out for lunch by a boss and being told that, well, we'd love to take you on. We're not quite sure, but, I don't really take on people who don't drink because in the past, because it's just not really worked out and not really worked out. Presumably because it's to do with socializing or whatever. And I wanted to sort of, that's the kind of scene that I wanted to imagine. And what does Zara do? What's the test for her? What's the way of her approaching things? Well, she pretends. So she pretends to drink the wine, and it's something that she slightly regrets later. But she also finds that she's maintained some level of her integrity as she sees it. So all these points, these pressure points, You try and put your characters in situations where you don't really know what they were going to do. And I didn't really know what she was going to do when I set her up like that. But it just seemed like the right thing to do, that she wouldn't. She would sort of pretend but try and get away with it, as it were. So that's the story of the book, really. And those are the two characters as they're set up. Maybe I'll just read finally a little bit from I don't know. What should we do? Should we have a scene with them together, maybe, so you get a sense of her personality, their personality together, and then we'll probably go to some questions after that. Okay. So Oscar and Zara have, this is towards the end of the book, so it's a flashback, but this is actually before they get married. So this is on one of those sort of peculiar non-date dates that you may or may not be familiar with, where people sort of go out and, have coffees together or go to events and just sort of size each other up. Working out how liberal the other person is and all the rest of it, whether you connect or whether you click in any way. What I'm fascinated by these events is because they're sort of parodies or mimicries of sort of, as it were, real dates, if you see what I mean. It's a way of doing dating, but for me, fictionally more interesting because the stakes are really, really high. Like, you can't go on these dates forever, and there's all sorts of limits and time limits, and people... and so what I was fascinated by, these characters are trying to, in a way, imitate a kind of date. And it actually links back to the last scene, talking about glasses and all the rest of it. Okay, so this is a short little extract. So Oscar and Zara on one of their early sort of dates. They found a pizza place nearby and sat down. The waiter, a disconcertingly handsome Frenchman, asked whether they wanted to see a wine list. Oscar said they didn't drink alcohol. The waiter removed their wine glasses briskly. I always think, said Zara, that when they take away the wine glasses, it's like they're punishing you for not drinking. It's like they're saying, you're only having soft drinks, so you can't have nice, posh glasses, only the ones that we give to children. It's money, said Oscar. These guys want tips for pouring the wine. Why do English people want to smell the wine before they taste it? It makes them feel important, I guess, said Oscar. But I don't know about wine, obviously. Trust me, English people don't know anything about it either. I mean, at Formal Hall, they just bought the cheapest stuff from the off-license and necked it. The waiter returned and they ordered 2 vegetarian pizzas and 2 Diet Cokes. When the waiter came with her drink, Zara found that it was too sweet. I think this is regular Coke, not diet, she told Oscar. Waiter, he called. Don't worry, she said, I can have normal. No. If it was wine, he would have asked you to taste it beforehand. Waiter, please, this is the wrong drink. He put the Coke to his lips and swilled a little in his mouth before swallowing it. It's normal when we ask for diet, he said sternly. The Frenchman removed the offending drink and quickly brought its correct replacement. Thanks, said Zara, taking a sip. No problem. My mum always says, if you're paying, then you're the boss. Your mum's a wise woman. If the service isn't good, she always argues with the staff. God, my dad does that as well. It's so embarrassing. You shouldn't feel like that. They push it because they think we can't speak English or are too ignorant to say anything. I don't like making a fuss, she said. I suppose I'm quite English like that. English people don't need to make a fuss because they get respect already. We have to stand up for our rights, whether it's about Palestine or getting the right kind of Coke. Exactly, said Oscar with a smile. There you go. So if anyone has any questions about that or any of the rest of the extracts, do stick your hand up and ask me.
Salwar.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't quite mean to make it all about wine, but it somehow turned into that. But anyway.
If we have any questions. So in introductions, there are very few Muslim novels written. Why do you think that's the case? I mean, Muslims have been here for quite a long time.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Why is that? Muslims have been here a long time, it's true, but it does take a long time as well. So you'll find that a lot of the professions that Muslims have done well in, if you think about the NHS or doctoring or banking, all the rest of it, it's not only because these are well-paid professions that immigrants tend to want to do, because and children of immigrants tend to want to do. It's also because they ask certain things of you, but not others. They don't really. You don't really. You know, your opinion and your worldview doesn't really need to be particularly shaped if you're working as a doctor. You're not asked for opinions about X, Y, or Z. The kind of profession like journalism, or working in the literary world, or working as a critic, or working as a theatre director, or all those kinds of things, they ask you to bring yourself and everything about you and your experiences and your beliefs and everything to the table. And then there's a question of who is interested in these stories. Who wants to read about X, if you see what I mean? You have to be confident in some ways that people will want to identify with characters who are different from themselves. By people, I mean the people who read novels, and the people who read novels are overwhelmingly middle-class white people. And then the question is, do you want to write a book for them, as it were, or do you want to write a book for characters who are a bit like the people in the book? It's a tricky maneuver, I think. I personally wanted to write a book for myself and for readers, that any kind of reader, but I specifically did not want to write a book that told people, the general audience, what they already knew or what they already thought they knew. So that's that. I've been lucky enough to be able to publish this book, and let's see what happens. There are a couple of others this summer as well, actually being published. Aisha Malik has published This Green and Pleasant Land, which is about a mosque being built in a village. And there's also a guy called Harun Khan who wrote a book called The Study Circle, small publisher, quite a serious, gritty novel set in South London to do with like the rise of the far right, quite political, different from this, but he's a nice guy, and it's an interesting development. I just hope there's more of us, really. The challenge really is form as well. So in a way, when I pitched this to an editor, I knew I found the right editor when the editors told me it's actually a really English novel, isn't it? And that's true. I mean, it is in a way a comic English novel, except all the characters are British Muslims, pretty much. So in a way, you can exploit the tension between the form of the book and the characters in it. But yeah, there just should be more, really. Hi.
What would your advice be to someone that was considering writing a novel? And how would you even start? Not that I am, but I'm just asking.
We're all not writing a novel, that's true. No, I'd always wanted to write since I was very young. I just read a lot as a teenager and growing up, read a lot of books, found a love for the English language, which I'd never thought of as something alien or foreign or different. I thought of it as mine, and exploiting the resources of that. I think finding a way of telling the story you want to tell is the most important thing, because once you work out the form of it, then everything else follows. Don't worry about things like the ideas or the conflicts or anything like that, because you'll have those things already embedded in your consciousness. Think about how you can dramatize those situations using characters and using drama, really. So, as I said, the first idea for this book I had in 2009. I spent the first year writing the first 10,000 words and polishing and perfecting it. I won't go through the ins and outs of that, but those 10,000 words were gradually reduced and reduced and reduced over the years. It was the opening of the book. Those 10,000 words are now 4 lines, about 3/4 of the way through the book. So it took me a year to write 4 lines, basically. I think they're pretty good lines. They're pretty good, but it did take a very long time. By about the end of 2015, I had a 120,000 word draft, which I was very pleased with. And I gave it to a good friend of mine who is a very good editor. And she told me very kindly that, yeah, it gets going pretty much in the last 2/3. So, I felt a bit devastated for a day, and then I went back to it, and I cut out the first 2/3 of the book. So basically, I just lost 80,000 words. And I took the last 40,000 words, which was actually the last year of their marriage, the first year of the marriage, as it were. And that was right. That's where you needed to start. You needed to start where the point was at its most dramatic. And then you could feed in the other things and expand that. And then it was quite quick, because I'd been thinking about it quite a long. And then it took me about 2 years to write the whole thing. And then when it was submitted to editors at the beginning of last year, there was a bit of editorial work, but it was basically done by that point. So in a way, it's taken 9 years, but it's also taken about 2 years to write this version. So I think persistence is like a real key thing. You just need to keep on going and keep on working at it.
Thanks for your talk. I don't know how coherent this question is, but it's something I think of sometimes when I'm thinking about how authors are going through their process, similar to Khadija's question. How much of this story is the story that you feel you want to tell yourself, like a story that you feel you have to get out there, and how much of it is the story that you, as a reader, wants to read, or how much of it is the story that you feel people need to read, so to speak? Is it written? Is the story told with the feeling that people need to hear this, or is the story told with the feeling I need to tell this story?
I think always when you say people need to hear this, it feels a little bit like you're sort of saying it's morally virtuous to read my book. And that puts all sorts of pressure on it. I mean, there's a lot of jokes in this book, and more and more jokes went in as it went along, because I gave it to people and they said, yeah, it's good, just put more jokes into it. So one thing I wanted to do is I think that this community, the people I grew up in, my family, it's full of jokes and laughter and just a lot of humor there, which I wanted to tap into. Not because it was a sort of simplistic humanizing, Muslims can laugh too, but simply because it's a great resource. And if you don't tap into that, you're sort of wasting a magnificent opportunity. Yeah, it's the story that I felt that I wanted to write, and obviously it's very personal without being autobiographical. I did also think that, if somebody, if I don't do it, then somebody else will do it. Surely somebody's going to take these stories and is going to try and really do something with them. And it just waited years and years, and then it just wasn't really happening, and it sort of still hasn't really happened. And it was what you were saying, the question earlier. Why aren't there more of these kinds of books out there? Why do they have to bear the burden of being a British Muslim novel? Why can't they just be a novel? They can be, but we're at the beginning of a process. And it just needs more writers to get out there and force themselves into situations where they can write books that get published. And of course, it needs publishers and editors to be more open-minded about what counts as novel. I did have some very weird experiences and lunches with editors who just did not get the book at all and wanted it to be something completely different. Not necessarily who you would expect. Like there's, this is being recorded, so I can't really say, but I'll talk to you afterwards. Yeah, it's not who you expect necessarily who comes up with the really stereotyped views of what a British Muslim novel should be like, actually. Yeah, I don't think that really answers your question, but yeah.
So Amitav Ghosh has this book called The Great Derangement, where he talks about why novels are unable to deal with things like climate change.
Yeah.
And his hypothesis is that the European mind and the medium of the novel is unable to tell stories in a dramatic enough way to capture these really huge events.
Yeah.
Whereas the kind of Indian way of narrating the world is much more about gods and huge events and disasters. And do you think that has something to do with why there's not more of a culture of novels in the British Muslim community or the Muslim community.
Yeah, that's interesting. That is a brilliant book, actually, by Untitled Chapter. I'm glad you mentioned that. And it is a matter of style in some ways. I've always liked the realist novel, but then that's not just because I've grew up reading Jane Austen, which I did, and I really love her, and she's obviously an influence on this book. But also the kind of stories that I've been told about the prophets, or that there are big stories with dramatic events, but they're also got little sort of intricate details of how people speak and how people behave, and narrative is narrative, and I suppose the way the European novel developed is that it did start off in a very baggy, loose way, and then it got more and more sort of personal. But for me, there has been a lot of the phenomenon of magic realism in the 1970s and 80s, and Rushdie is one of those people who tried to do that, incorporate those things. Let's say in Midnight's Children. But in a way, for me, that never really spoke to me in the same way that a novel like A Suitable Boy does, Vikram Seth's. That is equally, as it were, grounded in Indian experience and completely authentic, but it's taking the form of the 19th century English novel and putting it in Indian form. So there's different ways of doing it. I think it's more to do with sensibility of the individual author, I think. Interestingly, Amitav Ghosh has written this novel now, which is meant to sort of include some of these big dramatic events that he says that the European novel can't really accommodate. And in a way, he's justified his own thesis by writing a book that isn't really very successful, because it doesn't really quite work. The essays are brilliant, though. They're really, really interesting.
Thank you for sharing what I thought were some really interesting extracts. I got the sense, though, that though you, it comes across as comical, there's also a certain bleakness to the Muslim experience in Britain from the extracts. What makes you arrive at that? Is it anecdotal or is it empirical? I thought it was lacking, in a sense, in a positive sort of strand.
First of all, there's no empirical. The great thing about novels is that they can't prove anything because they don't utilize facts. So novels don't really prove anything about a community, a society, or anything, because it actually is all made up. Conversely, they draw their strength, certainly the kind of novel that this is, draws its strength on having a level of familiarity with the way real things, with the way reality really works. The shorthand is that all the most fantastical and weird things that happen in this novel actually happened, and all the most sort of boring, mundane, everyday things didn't have to make up. So that's in terms of evidence. As for bleakness, I don't know. I hope it's not a bleak novel. I hope it's one that has. No. Bleak can be good, yeah. I mean, bleak has. There's lots of great novels which have a lot of bleakness in them. But I didn't want to give a rosy. I wanted to dig deep into the sort of really the things that you can't discuss anywhere else, you can't think about anywhere else, other really than in fiction. Those sort of deep conflicts that kind of tear at you as a person and as a community, that really feel like you just don't know how to resolve these things. And somehow giving expression to them through drama and through characters perhaps enables you to feel some sort of consolation for it. But yeah, I mean, it's not an easy situation to be in, where you have your own, you're trying to negotiate what you think of your own religion, first of all, and what relationship you have to it, to what extent you accept X and you reject Y, or can you mold, can you reform, can you do this or that? And that's a very natural process, particularly for immigrant communities. Layered on top of that, you have this huge sort of media narrative, or sort of the phenomenon of terrorism and all the rest of it, which leads the stakes to become just so much higher. And perfectly innocent words like madrasa suddenly become, when they're read out on the news, you know that it's inevitably followed by place where X has been trained to be a suicide bomber, whilst for us it's just like where we went Noah Hill in the 1990s. So part of this was not, without any kind of crude political intention. It was just like, I'm normalizing all this now. Yes, so when they go to madrasa, they go to madrasa. That's what they do, because those are what the characters do. And there are no sort of explanations of, like, in brackets, madrasa, school, or sometimes I've even seen, like, people put all these words in italics because they're foreign words. But of course, when people are speaking them, they don't think they're foreign, so they shouldn't be in italics. So I was very careful with my editor that we don't put any Arabic or Gujarati words that these characters use, or Swahili words, in italics. And there's no glossary at the back to explain what these words mean or anything like that. You work it out from the context. And in that sense, going back to the Jewish authors of the 50s and 60s, they did that. They were totally confident in the way they expressed themselves. So yeah, I suppose it's a wider question of bleakness, but makes you laugh, makes you cry. I hope that's what happens.
Thank you so much, Sameer. I think we're going to have to end there, as it's Salah time. Salawat.
Should we say?
Yeah, so I'm sure Sameer's going to be around after Salah, and inshallah we'll do the book signing and sales.
Yeah,
after
so if you want to buy a book, this is the vulgar bit. If you want to buy a book, it's £10, cheaper than you get it anywhere else, and I'll sign it for you as well if you want to as well.